The afternoon heat in downtown Dallas felt unbearable that day. Warm sunlight entered through the glass windows of my clothing shop, while slow traffic moved outside across the busy street. Business had been painfully quiet since morning, and honestly, I was already tired of pretending to organize the same shirts for the 10th time. I sat behind the counter scrolling through random videos on my phone, while soft music played quietly through the speakers above me. The shop smelled faintly of fresh fabric and coffee from the cafe next door. Normally, I hated slow days. But looking back now, maybe that quiet afternoon changed my life completely. The bell above the entrance door suddenly rang softly. I looked up automatically, and for 1 second, my brain genuinely stopped working. A young guy had just walked into the shop, wearing a black hoodie and faded blue jeans. His dark hair looked slightly messy from the summer heat outside, and he carried himself with calm confidence without even trying. Honestly, he was ridiculously attractive, not in an arrogant social media model way, just naturally, effortlessly. For a second, I completely forgot how customer service worked. Then he smiled politely. "Hey," he said casually, "you still open?" I blinked quickly and stood up from the counter. "Yeah, of course." Smooth, very professional. The guy glanced around the shop slowly, while soft sunlight reflected across the shelves around him. "I'm looking for something simple," he explained. "Maybe hoodies or oversized shirts." I nodded immediately. "Yeah, I can show you." Trying to act normal, I walked toward the clothing racks while internally questioning why I suddenly felt nervous inside my own shop. "This section's newer stock," I explained casually. "Most people usually like these." The guy picked up a dark gray hoodie from the rack. "This one's actually nice. You got good taste." He smirked faintly hearing that. Or maybe your shop's just good. That answer caught me slightly off guard. I laughed softly. Finally, somebody appreciates my hard work. The conversation became easier after that. Way easier than it should have been with a complete stranger. While he looked through clothes, we casually talked about random things, Dallas traffic, terrible summer weather, music, and how impossible it was finding decent oversized clothes lately. His name was Adrian, and the more he talked, the more impossible it became not to pay attention to him. There was something calm about the way he carried himself. Comfortable, like he never forced conversations, yet somehow still made people want to keep listening. At one point, he disappeared into the changing room with a few hoodies while I leaned against the counter, pretending not to care. A few minutes later, the curtain opened slightly. "How's this look?" I looked up, and honestly, the hoodie somehow looked better on him than it did hanging in the store all week. "It looks good," I admitted. Adrian smirked slightly. "You hesitated." I was being professionally thoughtful. "That sounds fake." I laughed quietly. "Okay, fine. It actually looks really good." The small smile he gave afterward stayed in my head longer than it should have. Eventually, Adrian came back out carrying several shirts over his arm. Instead of heading directly toward checkout, though, he stayed leaning casually against the counter, talking to me. Most customers normally rushed out quickly after buying something. Adrian didn't seem in any hurry at all. "You own this place yourself?" he asked while glancing around the shop. "Yeah, that's impressive." I shrugged lightly. "Mostly exhausting." He laughed softly. "But still impressive." Something about hearing genuine admiration in his voice affected me more than expected. Maybe because most people treated the shop like just another random store. But Adrian actually seemed interested in listening whenever I talked. Outside, evening sunlight slowly turned golden while fewer people walked through the streets now. The atmosphere inside the shop became quieter, calmer. At one point, I noticed Adrian staring toward an unopened door near the back hallway. "What's back there?" he asked casually. "Storage room mostly." I replied, "Extra stock." Adrian nodded thoughtfully, then smiled slightly. "You hiding better clothes back there?" I laughed. "Maybe." For a second, I hesitated, then finally said, "You can check if you want." Honestly, I don't even know why I invited him. Maybe curiosity. Maybe loneliness. Maybe because somewhere deep down, I already didn't want the conversation ending yet. Adrian followed me toward the back room while soft music continued echoing quietly through the nearly empty shop. The storage room itself was warmer and smaller than the front store area. Clothing boxes lined the walls, while a small lamp cast soft yellow light across the room. Adrian looked around curiously. This actually feels cozy. That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said about my storage room. He laughed quietly again, and somehow hearing him laugh inside that quiet little room made the entire evening feel different, more personal somehow. For a few moments we kept talking casually while looking through unopened clothing boxes together. But underneath the normal conversation, I could feel something slowly changing between us. The eye contact lasted slightly longer now. The silences felt softer instead of awkward. Even standing close beside him started making me strangely aware of everything around me. The music, the warmth in the room, the sound of traffic outside, fading further into the evening. At one point, Adrian leaned lightly against the shelf beside me and sighed quietly. "You know," he admitted softly, "I almost didn't come in here today." I looked toward him. "Why?" He shrugged faintly. "Long day. Bad mood." Then he smiled slightly. "But honestly, I'm glad I did." Something about the sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten unexpectedly, because somehow, after only one evening, I was already feeling the exact same way. And somewhere between quiet conversations, warm summer light, and the peaceful silence inside that little shop, a complete stranger had started becoming impossible for me to ignore. By the time evening fully settled over downtown Dallas, the shop looked completely different. The bright sunlight from earlier had disappeared, replaced by warm yellow lights reflecting softly across the glass windows. Outside, fewer cars moved through the streets now while neon signs from nearby stores glowed against the darkening sky. Normally I close the shop around this time, but somehow Adrian was still there. And honestly, I didn't want him to leave yet. Soft music played quietly from the speakers, while Adrian leaned casually against the counter scrolling through songs on his phone. "You seriously listen to this?" he asked dramatically after hearing one of my playlists. I looked offended immediately. What's wrong with my music? It sounds like somebody recently survived emotional heartbreak. That's called artistic taste. Adrian laughed softly. The sound instantly made the quiet shop feel warmer somehow. For the last hour we've been talking nonstop about random things: music, relationships, work stress, childhood memories, even embarrassing high school stories neither of us should have admitted out loud. And strangely, every conversation felt easy, natural, like we'd known each other longer than a single evening. At some point I locked the front door, without even thinking much about it. Not because anything inappropriate was happening. I just knew no customers were coming this late anyway. Adrian noticed immediately. "You closing early because of me?" I shrugged casually. "Maybe you're special." "That sounds dangerous." "Probably." He smiled faintly after that. For a few seconds we just stood there in comfortable silence while soft music echoed around the empty store. Then Adrian glanced around again before speaking quietly. "You spend all your time here?" "Pretty much." "That sounds lonely." The honesty in his voice caught me slightly off guard. Most people thought owning a shop sounded exciting. Adrian somehow noticed the exhausting part immediately. I leaned back against the counter slowly. "Sometimes it is." Adrian nodded like he understood more than I expected. For the first time since meeting him earlier, I noticed tiredness hidden underneath his confident personality too. Not physical tiredness, emotional tiredness. The kind people carry silently. At one point, I grabbed cold drinks from the mini fridge near the storage room and handed him one. "Thanks," he said softly. We ended up sitting together inside the back room afterward, because honestly it felt quieter there, more personal. The small lamp beside the shelves cast warm light across the room, while distant traffic sounds echoed faintly outside the shop walls. Adrian sat beside stacked clothing boxes, while I leaned against the opposite wall. Neither of us seemed interested in checking the time anymore. So, I asked eventually, "What do you actually do when you're not randomly judging people's playlists?" Adrian laughed quietly. "I work at a gym." "That explains why you look annoyingly healthy." He smirked. "You saying you noticed?" That wasn't a compliment. "Sure." I shook my head while laughing softly. "But honestly, He was attractive in ways that became harder to ignore the longer we talked. Not just physically. It was the way he listened carefully whenever I spoke. The calm confidence in his voice. The small smiles he tried hiding whenever conversations became personal. At some point, the conversation shifted naturally into deeper topics. Relationships, loneliness, family pressure, life plans that never worked out properly. Adrian stared down at his drink quietly before admitting something softer this time. You ever feel surrounded by people all the time, but still alone somehow? The question hit me harder than expected, because, honestly, I understood exactly what he meant. I looked toward him carefully. All the time. Adrian nodded slowly. For a few seconds, silence settled between us. Not awkward, just real. The music outside the storage room continued quietly, while warm air filled the small space around us. Adrian leaned his head lightly back against the wall. Most people think I'm confident, he admitted quietly. But honestly, I just learned how to act like everything's fine. Something about hearing that made him feel more human suddenly, more vulnerable beneath the calm personality he showed everyone else. I laughed weakly under my breath. I think everybody's pretending a little. Adrian looked toward me again. Maybe. Then he smiled faintly. You seem easier to talk to than most people, though. That answer stayed in my chest longer than it should have, because deep down, I felt the exact same thing about him. Hours somehow passed without either of us noticing. The city outside became quieter, while the atmosphere inside the shop felt calmer and warmer than ever. At one point, Adrian stood up to stretch slightly before walking toward the front window. Rain had started falling lightly across the streets outside now, reflecting neon lights across the wet pavement. He stared outside for a moment before speaking softly. This feels weird. I walked closer beside him. What does... He smiled faintly without looking away from the rain. Meeting somebody randomly and feeling comfortable this quickly. The honesty in his voice made my heartbeat speed up slightly, because I'd been thinking the exact same thing all night. I leaned lightly against the counter beside him. Maybe that's rare. Yeah, Adrian admitted quietly. I think it is. For a second, neither of us moved. The rain outside softened into a peaceful rhythm while yellow lights reflected across the empty shop around us. The emotional tension between us felt impossible to ignore now. Not rushed, not overwhelming, just quietly growing stronger with every conversation. Adrian finally looked toward me again, and honestly, the expression in his eyes made the entire room suddenly feel smaller, softer, warmer. He smiled slightly. I'm really glad I walked into this shop today. I felt myself smiling back without even trying. Me too. And somewhere between late-night conversations, rainy city lights, and emotional honesty inside that quiet little shop, neither of us wanted the night to end anymore. After that night, my entire routine started feeling different. At first, I tried convincing myself it was nothing serious, just a random customer, a good conversation, one interesting night. But the problem was, Adrian stayed inside my head constantly afterward. While organizing clothes, I thought about him. While opening the shop every morning, I checked my phone hoping for messages. Even late at night, when the city outside became quiet and empty, my mind somehow replayed every conversation we shared inside that little back room. And honestly, that scared me more than I wanted to admit. A few days after meeting him, Adrian started visiting the shop regularly. Sometimes he bought something small. Sometimes he came with coffee. Sometimes he just sat near the counter talking to me for hours while pretending he wasn't distracting me from work. The employees from nearby stores started noticing too. One afternoon, the guy from the cafe next door smirked at me while handing over my coffee. Your boyfriend coming today? I nearly dropped the cup. He's not my boyfriend. The guy laughed loudly. Relax. I'm joking. But even after walking back into my shop, the comment stayed stuck inside my mind. Because deep down, I knew this connection with Adrian wasn't casual anymore. And maybe he knew it too. One evening, Adrian arrived later than usual, looking unusually tired. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes, and for the first time since meeting him, his smile looked forced. You okay? I asked carefully. He nodded too quickly. Yeah, just work stuff. I didn't fully believe him. Still, I didn't push. Instead, we sat together near the front counter, while rain tapped softly against the windows outside. The shop felt warm and quiet beneath the dim evening lights. Adrian stared toward the street, silently for a while, before finally speaking. You ever get scared when somebody starts mattering too much? The question caught me completely off guard. I looked toward him slowly. What do you mean? Adrian laughed weakly under his breath. I don't know. He rubbed his hands together tiredly. Every time I get emotionally close to someone, things eventually fall apart. Something painful hid underneath his calm voice now. Something heavier than before. I stayed quiet, letting him continue. My last relationship messed me up pretty badly, he admitted softly. After that, I promised myself I wouldn't let people get too close again. Hearing that hurt more than expected, because suddenly I understood why Adrian sometimes became distant emotionally even during good moments together. He wasn't cold. He was scared. And honestly, I understood that feeling too well myself. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke afterward. Outside, headlights reflected across the wet Dallas streets while soft music echoed quietly inside the empty shop. Then Adrian suddenly stood up. I should probably go. I frowned slightly. You just got here. Yeah, he replied quietly. I know. The strange sadness in his voice stayed with me long after he left that night. And after that, things slowly started changing between us. Not dramatically at first, just small differences. Replies became slower, conversations shorter. Sometimes Adrian disappeared for hours or entire days, without explanation. Then suddenly he'd return acting completely normal again. The inconsistency slowly drove me insane. One night, I sat alone inside the closed shop staring at our old messages while rain poured heavily outside. I hated how emotionally attached I'd become so quickly. More than that, I hated not knowing if Adrian felt the same way anymore. Finally, frustrated and exhausted, I called him. He answered after several rings. Hey! His voice sounded tired again. I leaned back against the counter slowly. Are you avoiding me? Silence. Then finally, no, you disappeared for 2 days. I've just been busy. The answer sounded rehearsed, distant. For the first time since meeting him, frustration pushed past my patience. I muttered quietly, you're really hard to understand sometimes. Another long silence followed. Then Adrian finally admitted softly, I'm trying not to ruin this. The honesty in his voice immediately weakened my anger. I closed my eyes briefly. Adrian, I mean it, he interrupted quietly. The more I care about somebody, the more I start pulling away. That sentence hit painfully close to home, because deep down, I'd already started fearing the exact same thing. The call ended strangely afterward. Not angry, not resolved, just emotionally unfinished. And honestly, that felt worse somehow. Over the next week, Adrian visited the shop less and less. Every time the entrance bell rang, part of me automatically looked up, hoping it was him. Most days it wasn't. The loneliness inside the shop suddenly felt heavier now, without him there filling the silence. One rainy evening, I stayed late reorganizing shelves just to distract myself from overthinking. The city outside looked blurry beneath the storm while thunder echoed faintly somewhere far away. I leaned against the counter tiredly and checked my phone again. Still nothing. For the first time since all this started, real doubt settled inside my chest. Maybe Adrian regretted getting close to me. Maybe I imagined emotional connection between us. Maybe this whole thing mattered more to me than it ever did to him. The thought genuinely hurt. Then finally, almost near midnight, the shop door opened suddenly. I looked up immediately. Adrian stood there soaked from rain, breathing heavily like he'd rushed all the way there. For 1 second, neither of us moved. Water dripped slowly from his dark hoodie onto the shop floor, while city lights glowed behind him through the glass doors. Then Adrian looked at me with exhausted honesty in his eyes and quietly admitted, I couldn't stay away from you anymore. And in that moment, every emotional wall I'd spent days building around myself started breaking apart again. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. Rain poured heavily outside the shop windows, while cold wind entered through the still-open door behind Adrian. Water dripped slowly from his hoodie onto the floor, and his chest rose unevenly like he'd been running through the storm just to get here. I stared at him in complete silence. Part of me felt relieved seeing him. The other part still felt hurt. Adrian slowly stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The soft bell above the entrance echoed quietly through the empty shop. "I know I disappeared," he admitted softly. I leaned back against the counter, crossing my arms. "Yeah, you did." The guilt in his expression immediately became obvious. For the first time since meeting him, Adrian looked completely emotionally exhausted. Not guarded, not confident, just honest. The warm yellow lights inside the shop reflected softly across the rain-covered windows, while thunder echoed somewhere far away across downtown Dallas. Adrian rubbed his hands nervously before speaking again. I kept trying to stay away because I thought it would make things easier. I looked at him carefully. "For who?" He laughed weakly under his breath. "Probably myself." The honesty in his voice immediately softened some of the frustration I'd been holding on to all week. Still, I stayed quiet. Adrian slowly walked closer toward the counter. "You scare me a little," he admitted. That answer caught me completely off guard. I frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because this feels real." The room suddenly felt very quiet after that. Even the rain outside seemed softer somehow. Adrian looked down briefly before continuing. "I spent so much time convincing myself I didn't need emotional connections anymore." He smiled sadly. "Then somehow I walked into your shop one random afternoon and ruined all that." I couldn't help laughing softly at that. "You make it sound tragic." "It kind of is." That finally made me smile for real again. And honestly, seeing my smile seemed to relax Adrian immediately too. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke afterward. Then finally, I admitted something quietly myself. "You disappearing hurt more than I expected." Adrian's expression softened instantly. "I know," he replied softly, "and I'm sorry." The sincerity in his voice made it impossible to stay angry much longer. I looked away briefly toward the rain-covered streets outside before speaking again. "You know the worst part?" "What?" I tried pretending I didn't care. I laughed weakly under my breath. "Didn't work at all." Adrian smiled faintly. "Same." That single word somehow removed weeks of emotional tension between us. Not because everything suddenly became perfect, because for the first time, neither of us were hiding anymore. Adrian leaned lightly against the counter across from me. "I think I forgot how to let somebody matter to me without panicking," he admitted quietly. I nodded slowly. I think I forgot too. The emotional honesty between us felt strangely calming now instead of terrifying. Outside, rainwater rolled slowly down the shop windows, while neon lights reflected across the empty Dallas streets. The entire city felt distant compared to quiet warmth inside the shop. At one point, Adrian glanced around the room before smiling softly. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "A month ago, this was just some random clothing store." I smirked slightly. "Excuse you. This is a very professional establishment." "Right. Extremely professional." We both laughed quietly. And somehow that simple laughter made everything feel lighter again. The fear, the confusion, the emotional distance. Little by little, it all started disappearing beneath honesty. Eventually, I grabbed 2 cold drinks from the mini fridge again like I had the first night we met. Adrian smiled immediately seeing that. "That feels familiar." "Yeah," I admitted softly. "It does." We ended up sitting together inside the back storage room again, while rain continued falling outside. The same warm lamp glowed softly across the stacked clothing boxes around us. But tonight felt different from the first time we sat here together. Back then, everything was curiosity and tension. Now it felt calmer, safer, real. Adrian leaned back against the wall, quietly while looking toward me. "I don't know exactly what this becomes," he admitted honestly, "but I know I don't want to run away from it anymore." Hearing that settled something deep inside my chest. Because honestly, that was all I wanted too. Not promises, not perfect answers. Just honesty. I smiled softly at him. Good, I replied quietly, because I'm tired of pretending this doesn't matter. For a moment, neither of us looked away. The warm light filled the small room while distant thunder echoed softly outside the shop walls. And somewhere between late-night conversations, emotional fear, rain-covered city streets, and quiet honesty, two lonely people finally stopped running from feelings they could no longer ignore. The shop officially closed hours ago, but neither of us seemed ready to leave yet, because for the first time in a long while, being there together finally felt like home.